Most riders think the oil change is done the moment they tighten the filter and wipe the pan. But the truth is, the real danger starts after the job looks finished. Those first 60 seconds after you hit the starter decide whether your engine settles into a clean cycle or begins wearing itself out faster than you'll ever hear. Dealers don't explain this, manuals bury it, and younger techs rush through it. But old hands know better. They've seen engines scuff and starve simply because someone skipped one tiny post-change step. If you want the truth, the manuals won't say out loud. Watch this one till the end, it will save your motor. The hidden check that most riders skip. Most riders think the job is done the moment the fresh oil hits the pan. The truth is, the reading you get right after you refill is almost never accurate. Oil settles, oil shifts, oil clings to ribs in the sump and to the walls of the crankcase. When the engine warms, that entire volume redistributes, and the level you saw on the dipstick a few minutes earlier becomes meaningless. Older engines exaggerate this behavior because their internal surfaces have years of heat cycles baked into them. Those surfaces hold residue and film that fresh oil has to work through before finally settling where it belongs. If you check only once, you might believe the level is correct, when it is actually sitting low enough to create trouble down the road. A seasoned hand knows that oil needs time and temperature to show its real height. When an engine idles and reaches operating warmth, the fluid expands and lifts into channels that stay dormant when cold. That movement changes the reading. And if you skip the second check, you never know what the engine is truly carrying. Many riders assume full means full, but engines do not think that way. Fluids behave differently under heat, motion, and pressure. A careful recheck after warm-up catches the truth. And that small moment of discipline matters, because the next danger hides in a place riders rarely look closely enough. The double seal trap. When you spin off an old filter, you expect the rubber gasket to come with it. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it stays glued to the mounting pad, thin enough to blend into the metal and slick enough to be invisible under a film of used oil. That is where trouble starts. If you screw on a fresh filter without noticing that leftover ring, you stack two seals together, creating a surface that cannot compress evenly. It does not leak immediately. It does something worse. It creates a slow bleed down that happens only when the system is hot and under load, pulling oil away from the upper end without ever leaving a puddle on the floor. Veteran mechanics learned this lesson the hard way. They run a fingertip around the mounting surface every single time, not because it is habit, but because they know that old rubber can bond itself to metal after countless heat cycles. That tactile check takes 1 second, yet it prevents hours of frustration later. The double seal trap is a quiet thief. It does not create dramatic drips. It creates a gradual loss that thins out the reserve while you ride, leaving the upper valve train with less support than it needs. Riders who trust visual inspection alone miss it, and the engine pays the price. And while that hidden ring causes its own brand of trouble, another overlooked mistake begins long before the filter ever comes off. Before we move on, tap like so this gets in front of more riders who need the truth. Subscribe if you want real mechanical breakdowns without the fluff. And share your experience in the comments with your experience on oil changes, so we can compare what actually happens out there. Cold oil contamination retention. Cold oil behaves like syrup. It clings to galleries, hides in casting pockets, and traps every bit of carbon soot and microscopic grit that came from the previous cycle. A cold drain pulls out only part of that mixture. The rest hangs onto the metal because its thickness keeps it from moving freely. The moment you refill with fresh oil, that leftover sludge blends into the new charge and weakens it from the start. You think you have given the engine a clean slate, but you have actually carried old contaminants into a new cycle. Warm draining changes the entire picture. When an engine idles for a handful of minutes, the oil thins, loosens its grip, and flows with speed. Heat drops its viscosity dramatically, allowing the fluid to sweep debris out of those tight corners and bring it to the drain stream. That is why seasoned mechanics always warm an engine before pulling the plug. They know the difference between a partial drain and a complete one. They know that oil left trapped in the galleries shortens the life of the fresh charge before the ride even begins. A clean oil change is not just about the new fluid, it is about clearing out the old film that wants to stay behind. But even when riders drain warm and refill carefully, one more silent mistake can undo everything they just did. The overfill foam reaction. Some riders pour in a little extra just to be safe. That habit does not protect an engine. It puts it at risk. Oil sits close to the crank in most engines, and the counterweights slice through the air gap above the surface. When that surface rises too high, the counterweights strike the oil directly. At speed, those impacts whip the fluid like a mixer, pulling air into it and turning it into a frothy blend. That foam cannot protect anything. It collapses the moment stress hits it, leaving metal without a steady film. The engine might show a perfect reading on the dipstick, but the lubricating ability of the foam is far less than the number suggests. This failure is subtle, because the engine still has plenty of fluid, yet the quality of that fluid has changed. Instead of a dense, smooth layer that can slide between metal surfaces, you get bubbles that burst, under load. Older riders who have watched engines apart on the bench understand how fragile that protective layer really is. They know that too much oil is just as risky as too little. Precision matters in both directions. An engine depends on proper measurement, not guesswork. And when riders understand how foam, heat, and fluid behavior work together, they realize the real danger of an oil change is not the job itself, but the small choices made afterward. Dry filter. A fresh filter looks harmless. It feels clean, solid, and ready to do its job, but inside those pleats sits nothing but air. The moment you hit the starter after an oil change, the pump shoves oil toward that empty chamber, and the engine waits for pressure that has not arrived yet. Those first few seconds matter more than new riders realize. A dry filter delays lubrication, and that delay reaches the top end before anything else. Older flat-tappet engines are especially sensitive because their contact surfaces rely on a steady film that forms the moment the crank begins to turn. When the filter is empty, that film does not appear quickly enough, and the result is a light scuffing that you never hear, but the metal remembers. Seasoned mechanics learned long ago that pre-wetting a filter saves an engine from unnecessary punishment. Even a partial fill creates enough internal coating to shorten that delay. Riders who skip this step claim they never notice a problem, but the wear is not loud. It is slow accumulation. Some older Harley and Honda motors develop a light tapping on the first start after a change. And that sound is the upper end asking for help while the filter finishes filling. What feels like a harmless oversight is really the engine running unprotected for just long enough to matter. And once that first delay passes, another quiet issue waits inside the pump itself. Circulation delay, drop. When an engine fires after a fresh change, the pump has a job list, and it follows that list whether the rider understands it or not. The first task is to fill the galleries that feed critical components. Those passages must be charged before anything else happens. The problem is that a newly installed filter pulls a surprising amount of oil out of the pan during its initial fill. That momentary draw lowers the available volume, and the pump compensates by pushing harder, sending oil where it must go while leaving other areas waiting their turn. Chain and belt tensioners feel that pause more than most riders realize, especially on engines that rely on hydraulic control for timing stability. When pressure arrives late, those tensioners lag, and that lag gives moving parts a chance to chatter. This is why older mechanics always warm the engine gently after a change. They know the system needs a brief calm period to stabilize flow before the revs climb. When riders snap the throttle too soon, they force components to rely on pressure that is not fully settled. The pump is doing its job, but the timing of that job is delicate. Those first minutes decide whether the engine eases into its cycle or fights against its own rhythm. And while flow settles inside the pump, another overlooked detail can start causing issues long before the rider notices anything on the ground. Dry O-ring twist. A filter seal looks simple, but the thin ring of rubber around its edge carries enormous responsibility. That ring must compress smoothly when the filter tightens. If it twists or drags across the mounting surface, the rubber scrapes, stretches, and heats against the metal. That friction creates small fissures too tiny to see, but large enough to respond when the engine reaches its full temperature. During long rides, those fissures expand, letting warm oil seep through in a mist so light you smell it before you ever see it. Riders often blame old gaskets or worn housings, but the real cause is a dry seal installed without a touch of lubrication. Mechanics who have spent years in the shop coat the ring with fresh oil as second nature. They do it because they have seen what happens when a dry seal binds on installation. The twisting does not create a puddle. It creates a weakness that shows itself only after the bike has been on the road for a while. Heat cycles force the seal to flex, and those microscopic injuries widen under the pressure. By the time a rider notices the faint smell of warm oil, the damage has already been done. And while a seal can fail from friction, the threads holding the entire system together face an entirely different threat. Thread stretch. Overload. Drain plug threads look strong, especially when made from steel, but the pan they screw into often is not. Aluminum pans rely on precise torque to hold a seal, and when riders lean too hard on a wrench, those threads begin to stretch. The metal yields little by little, changing shape in ways that cannot be undone. Most riders never notice the early signs. The plug feels tight, the washer compresses, and the engine holds its oil. But hidden beneath the head of that bolt, the threads have begun the slow process of fatigue. Over time, they lose their bite, and a light seep forms along the surface. It is not a dramatic failure. It is a quiet reminder that metal has limits. Older mechanics learned to trust the feel of a proper snug, rather than raw strength. They know aluminum surrenders when pushed beyond its range. A stretched thread does not show itself until the pan cools and warms through repeated cycles, each one widening the fatigue. By the time a rider sees the faint line of residue near the plug, the damage is permanent, and the repair often requires inserts or a new pan. Respecting torque is not about caution. It is about preserving the structure that keeps the engine sealed. And once these first startup dangers are understood, a rider sees that the real enemy is not the oil change, but the moments that follow. Ignoring the monitoring system. Riders who grew up before modern sensors often dismiss the oil life alert as another dashboard nag. But that warning does not measure mileage. It measures stress. It reads how many cold starts the engine endured, how often fuel dilution thinned the oil, how many short hops failed to burn off moisture, and how temperature cycles hammered the additive package until its chemistry started failing. When the alert finally pops up, it is telling you the oil can no longer neutralize the acids forming inside the crankcase. That chemical shift happens long before the oil looks dirty or smells burnt. You might think you have miles left, but the base number has already collapsed, and nothing inside the engine can slow that slide. Veteran riders understand that old instincts do not always match modern engineering. The oil in older machines lasted longer because the engines ran hotter, cleaner, and simpler. Modern systems create different stress patterns. When the alert triggers, it is not judging your riding style. It is protecting the chemistry that shields every moving part from corrosive buildup. Waiting another week or another ride might feel harmless, but every heat cycle after the alert increases the acid load. That is not wear and not starvation. It is chemical breakdown taking hold, quiet but steady. And once the oil has faced real temperature, another subtle shift can happen without any warning at all. The forgotten post-drive recheck. Most riders think checking oil after idle is enough, but a real ride changes the whole picture. When the engine reaches full operating heat, the oil thins, expands, and climbs deeper into the upper casting pockets. That expansion increases total volume, and when the bike sits afterward, the new level is not the same one you saw earlier. Touring engines from past decades exaggerate this behavior because their cases hold more surface area and more internal pockets where warm oil can settle. When riders refill to the mark, ride, and never recheck, they might unknowingly push the level above the safe window. It does not aerate at that point, but it raises the potential for unwanted pressure against the seals on the next cycle. Old-school mechanics always take one last reading after the first genuine road heat. They know idle warmth is not the same as a full-load highway session. On the highway, oil flows faster, spreads wider, and holds onto hot surfaces longer. When the bike is parked afterward, the oil that drains back gives a truer reading. If the engine sits slightly above the safe line, the rider overfilled it without meaning to, and that extra volume introduces stress on the next long run. The mistake is not dramatic. It is simple neglect of a final check that takes only a moment, but prevents unnecessary pressure buildup. And while expansion can fool the eye, another problem hides where riders cannot see it at all. If this breakdown is helping you understand what really happens under the metal, make sure you're subscribed. Every week, we dig into the issues most riders never hear about until it is too late. And staying subscribed keeps you ahead of the problems. The invisible pressure side leak. Some leaks never show themselves on the garage floor. They happen only when the engine is hot and the pressure side routing reaches full load. The seals in those lines expand differently under heat, and a small flaw becomes a tiny mist that escapes only when the system faces real pressure. Riders do not see drops. They catch a faint scent of warm oil drifting past the frame during a stop. Newer riders often ignore it or blame residue from a spill, but seasoned hands know the smell of a live seep. It is subtle and easy to overlook until the engine has run long enough for the mist to collect dust on nearby surfaces. This type of leak does not drain the engine or threaten volume. It shifts only when heat and pressure join together, opening the seal just enough to let a light vapor escape. Nothing pools, nothing drips, nothing stains the floor. That is why it fools people who rely on visual checks alone. Mechanics with years under their belt find these faults by feel, by scent, and by awareness of how seals behave under load. A cold inspection reveals nothing, but a hot-running engine exposes the weakness. Missing it does not cause starvation. It simply lets heat cycles erode the seal further with every mile. And while a hot-only seep hides itself, the next mistake is loud enough to announce trouble if a rider listens closely. The idle rev mistake. Old-school riders know better than to blip the throttle right after an oil change, but many younger do-it-yourselfers cannot resist the instinct to clear it out. When they crack the throttle, the return passages in the head fill faster than the system can settle. That surge churns the oil racing back toward the pan, sending a wave through passages designed for steady flow. It does not cause foam, and it does not cause starvation, but it triggers a flooding effect in the return path. Those head passages temporarily overload, slowing the system's ability to establish its normal rhythm. A calm idle would let everything equalize, but a quick rev disrupts that balance. Older mechanics have watched enough engines to know the first minute after a change is sacred. It is the moment when the system resets, fills the channels in order, and stabilizes pressure. Any sudden rush interrupts that process. Riders hear nothing unusual because the effect is internal, but the engine feels the disturbance. The oil that should return steadily instead arrives in uneven waves, forcing the system to manage flow patterns it does not expect. The cure is simple patience. Let the engine idle, breathe, and settle before giving it any extra throttle. And once riders understand how even a simple throttle blip can disrupt flow, they begin to see how many normal habits carry hidden consequences. How shops document oil change. Mistakes. Behind the service counter, every shop keeps a record that riders rarely see. Those records are not dramatic, and they are not meant to shame anyone, but they exist because technicians must explain every irregularity that shows up on the bench. When a bike arrives with residue around the filter, a crushed washer, or signs of overfill, the technician notes it in the job story because it protects the shop from being blamed later. The entry might be only a sentence or two, yet it sits in the file and follows the machine until the next inspection. Riders think mistakes disappear once the engine runs fine, but shops always document what they observe. It is part of the routine, part of the culture, and part of how technicians keep track of patterns. These notes influence decisions riders never hear about. If a mechanic sees repeated inconsistencies in how a machine arrives, that history shapes how the shop approaches the next service. Even warranty work depends on these quiet observations. When a claim is made, the service department looks through old notes to determine whether an issue connects to something seen earlier. Those observations might be small, but they matter because they shape the trust between the rider and the shop. There is no malice in the process. It is simply the way service departments protect themselves while giving each machine a clear history. And once those notes exist, another powerful force steps into the picture, shaping outcomes far beyond the service bay. Insurance and warranty pushback. Insurance carriers and warranty companies rely on paperwork more than anything else. They do not see the bike, feel the engine, or talk with the rider. They only process documents, timestamps, and technician notes. When a claim involving lubrication, overheating, or pressure irregularity arrives, they search for anything suggesting the maintenance record is incomplete. A single missing receipt or an unclear timestamp provides enough leverage for them to deny coverage. Riders think these decisions are personal, but the companies work strictly within the language of the policy. If an oil change was performed without the proper note, or if the interval does not match what the manufacturer expects, the claim faces immediate scrutiny. This is where frustration builds. A small oversight becomes a barrier, and the rider feels trapped behind a wall of fine print. The corporation points to the policy. The rider points to real-world experience. The two perspectives never align, and the process grinds forward with no sympathy. Warranty investigators look for anything that shifts responsibility away from the company. Without clear documentation, even a minor service inconsistency can turn into grounds for rejection. That is why seasoned riders always keep their receipts and keep their records organized. They know the paperwork matters as much as the maintenance itself. And as those documents accumulate, their influence reaches farther than claims alone. They shape the value of a machine when it enters the marketplace, the market ripple. When a bike reaches the used market, the first thing dealers inspect is the service history. They check for patterns, gaps, and inconsistencies. If the history looks uneven, they reduce the trade-in offer because they assume the machine carries risk. A sloppy oil change, even if harmless, creates visual evidence that a dealer cannot ignore. They do not gamble when buying used inventory. They look for signs of discipline in how the machine was treated. A well-kept record increases value. A questionable record lowers it. This is the quiet math of the marketplace. Trade-in penalties are not personal. They are probabilities. Dealers know machines with unclear service backgrounds take longer to sell, so they drop the offer instantly. A messy filter or vague paperwork sends the wrong signal, and buyers grow cautious. Even small doubts ripple through value, costing riders hundreds. The marketplace rewards precision and punishes uncertainty every time. And behind all these financial consequences, something older and deeper guides the riders who avoid these troubles completely. The rider's code. Among experienced riders, a quiet code exists. It is not written, and it is not taught in manuals. It comes from decades spent in garages, on long roads, and in countless conversations between old hands who learned through trial and error. the code centers on respect for the machine. Not fear, not obsession, but respect. Every step of maintenance becomes part of a ritual. The rider wipes the pan, checks the threads, sets the level carefully, and listens during the first moments of operation. Not because the manual demands it, but because it feels right. It is a discipline rooted in pride, not pressure. Riders know longevity comes from disciplined habits, not luck. A machine reflects the attention it receives, and shortcuts always cost more later. Engines last because the rider's mindset lasts, built on patience, awareness, and responsibility. This code keeps machines alive long after others fade and shapes the culture of motorcycling. The true secret to engine life is not the oil or parts, but the hands that care for them all. That's the full truth behind the little post-change habits that quietly kill engines. It's not hype. It's decades of real wrenching and real road miles. If you've got your own tips, mistakes, or shop stories, throw them down in the comments. If you got value out of this one, tap that like button and make sure you're subscribed. We've got more straight talk, more mechanical breakdowns, and more hard-earned lessons coming up.